Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's virtual event, Access Horror Presents Tropes and Traps for Filmmakers. My name is Carrie Candeloro, and I am the Access Coordinator at Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. I am a white disabled woman with a brown curly bob, currently wearing a beige shirt with red flowers, and behind me is a blurry image of my apartment with some long blue curtains. 2024 marks Lincoln Center's 10th year participating in the Real Abilities Film Festival, and we are so excited to once again partner with an organization that shares our joy in celebrating disability both on and off the screen. The festival ends tomorrow, so please check out realabilities.org/New York to catch the last of these phenomenal events. Tonight in this Zoom space, we welcome you to come as you are and be comfortable. I'll just spend a few moments before we get started highlighting Zoom functions and what to expect for the evening. This program is set in webinar format, which means that your cameras will remain off during the evening. We have captioning available for today's program. Thank you, Jane, for captioning. If you would like to use closed captioning, you can do so by clicking the box with the live transcript CC icon, which is usually located at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes this is called subtitle. You can change the size of the subtitles or view the full transcript. We have ASL interpretation for tonight's panel. Thank you, Kami and Emily, for joining us this evening. The ASL interpreters will be spotlit, and you can make them larger or smaller on your screen if you would like. During this event, you are welcome to submit your questions to our panelists using the Q&A function. Tonight's program will run 1 hour in length and will be recorded to be posted publicly on our YouTube channel on a future date. If you have any access needs or are having any technical issues, please message our tech and access doula, Katie, in the chat, and she can assist. Thank you, Katie, in advance for all your help. To get to the chat feature, there is an icon with a bubble, and it is usually at the bottom of your screen. Tonight, we are excited to partner with Access Horror to present Tropes and Traps for Filmmakers. Access Horror is a space to explore and celebrate the history, impact, and future of disability in the horror genre through conversations, connections, and various artistic forms, including film. They acknowledge the interwoven nature of identity and media representation and celebrate the many intersectional identities that have been at the heart of horror cinema since the beginning. They believe in horror as an agent of change and seek to elevate discourse that uplifts marginalized creators and gives them space to create new work that imagines new worlds. The Lincoln Center team was immediately excited about Ariel Vasquez's program and to highlight a genre that we don't often get to present, horror. We also really resonated with their mission, as Lincoln Center is committed to presenting a program in which all New Yorkers have the opportunity to see themselves and their stories represented. For example, tonight's event is just one of our many free live streams of select shows all season long, all of which offer closed captions. We feature concerts, theater, and dance events, and many more on our online stage. Our next live stream will be this Thursday, April 11th, featuring East and Middle East Asian traditional music by Wu Fei and Shanir Blumenkrantz. For a schedule of upcoming live streams, please visit our Lincoln Center Presents live stream webpage, and there's a link in the chat. Plus, you can always watch a selection of previous Lincoln Center live streams on demand via our YouTube channel at Lincoln Center. Thank you to Ravit Turjman, Isaac Zablocki, and the Real Abilities team for sharing such wonderful programming each year. There have been so many exciting events during the festival. I encourage you to visit realabilities.org/New York and check out other Real Abilities events before the festival ends tomorrow. And now, I'll talk a little bit more about our host for the evening, Ariel Vasquez. Ariel is a multi-award-winning, multiply disabled, queer, and horror documentary filmmaker who believes in advocacy and accessibility for historically underserved communities. Their work has played on Alaska Airlines and at film festivals from Berlin to Mexico City to Mumbai. They have presented with South by Southwest and the Berlinale on various topics in disability and accessibility in the film and television industry. They are the creator and festival director of Access Horror, a film festival and industry summit celebrating the history, future, and impact of disability and horror. Their work can be seen in many places, including museums, libraries, and airplanes, but their creative multiverse is most visible through Ride the Omnibus, their own media nonprofit and podcast over 200 episodes strong, parked at the intersection of pop culture and social justice. Regardless of what story they're telling or what work they're doing, Ariel cares passionately about the margins. And so, without further ado, Ariel Basca.
Hi, I'm Ariel Basca, Festival Director of Access Horror and filmmaker in horror and documentary. I'm a queer, disabled white person with blonde hair and a lopsided smile. I'm delighted to welcome three distinguished guests today to talk about tropes and traps that filmmakers fall into when they tell narratives about disabilities. I will introduce each panelist with a short bio and ask them to share a short visual description. Nasreen Al-Khatib. Nasreen is an award-winning filmmaker whose work illuminates historically excluded voices and normalizing intersectional storytelling. By illuminating racial injustice, disability inequity, and gender imbalance, Nasreen thrives as a leader in films that shift our culture. Her ability to motivate audiences is the direct result of approaching story through intersectional identities. Her cinematography has been featured by NASA, Apple, FX, Netflix, Oprah's Emmy-winning series Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. Her directing credits include Kamala Harris, Naomi Osaka, the United Nations, Microsoft, and the Women's March. Forbes described her as breaking barriers. Nasreen helped lead the Respectability Lab, dedicated to introducing disabled writers and directors to studios like Disney, Sony, Lionsgate, DreamWorks, and Warner Brothers. Welcome.
Hey everyone, happy to be here. My name is Nasreen. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I'm a multi-heritage Black and Middle Eastern woman with curly brown hair, wearing a square-necked gray top, sitting in a chair on Tongva land in Los Angeles, and my background is blurred.
Thank you so much, Nasreen, and I'd like to now introduce Ophira Kalof. Ophira Kalof is an award-winning disabled writer, performer, and facilitator who works to crypt the script, centering disability experience. Some of their recent credits include One More Time for the CBC, Kids in the Hall for Amazon Prime, and their solo show, Literally Titanium, which has been featured in both academic and performance spaces as a case study in accessible production. Ophira was the inaugural creative director for the Accessible Writers Lab, a national initiative exploring accessibility in TV writing room contexts, and was the accessibility process lead for Access CBC and curatorial lead for the 2022 Real Abilities Film Festival, Toronto. They have taught workshops internationally on storytelling, accessibility, and disability narratives. Welcome. If you wouldn't mind sharing a short visual description.
For sure. This is Ophira speaking. Thank you so much, Ariel. My name, as I said, Ophira, I use both they, them, and she, her pronouns. And I'm a white Ashkenazi disabled human with short, kind of poofy dark hair at the moment. I'm wearing owl light glasses and a deep blue shirt. And I'm seated in the most comfortable purple chair that I think exists in this world. And it felt very important to share that.
Awesome. And Kashmir Jasmine is also joining us. Kashmir is an Afro-Caribbean director with Southern roots based in LA. She creates genre-bending media, reimagining depictions of intersectional disability-inclusive stories. In 2021, Kashmir was a part of Amy Aniobi's tribe, the Black Magic Collective's All Access Fellowship, and Respectability's Summer Entertainment Lab. She also received the Sundance Uprise grant for her short film Oreo that became a 2022 Slam Dance Festival selection. Her surrealist feature Bitter, about an irresponsible dialysis patient, earned her a spot in the Sundance Accessible Futures Intensive to workshop her feature. Her short film project Cece was a part of Disney's Launchpad and earned multiple NAACP Image Award nominations. If you would also describe yourself, Kashmir.
Thank you so much, Ariel. My name is Kashmir Jasmine, and I am a Black woman with about shoulder length Afro hair. I am wearing a high collared gray or pastel shirt with a lot of faces on it. And behind me, you'll see my my shelf with various objects, perhaps a bit busier than I should have had it, but that's where it is now. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm truly excited to be here. Thank you guys so much.
Well, I am so excited that you all could join us, and I'm initially, going to start with the conversation before we get too into the weeds on where we are as filmmakers. I want to talk for a minute about what is a trope. What are we talking about when we talk about how tropes affect us? In my mind, tropes are the media narratives that you don't necessarily even notice are a part of your life until suddenly something doesn't quite fit. I wanted to welcome Ophira, perhaps, to share some of their thoughts about tropes and how tropes affect both how we think about media narratives and also how they affect us in the real world.
Sure. This is Ophira speaking. My favorite topic. I think tropes ultimately are a storytelling device, right? They're not a truth necessarily to a human person. They're something that helps us kind of understand a really clear structure and get a viewer or a reader or an audience member situated really quickly in a story. And when we do that with people and with lived experiences, what we're doing is essentially flattening a reality into something easily digestible that almost acts as a code or a groove, as Ariel was saying, sort of this default that we don't even have to think too much about. We just can fill in the rest of the trope in our minds and go forward in our story. And so with that, they're quite dehumanizing. And they both reflect some, because the content that we see both reflects societal beliefs, but also help shape them. And so I think tropes are a really big part of that cycle of shaping the ways in which we understand ourselves and each other, but in this very two-dimensional way.
I think that's so important to talk about the flattening that happens with the way that media narratives are crafted at times, creates this perspective that's completely off kilter. And so it's really important, I think, as we get further into this conversation, that we also make sure, since we're talking about tropes in horror, let's also make sure we understand what we're talking about when we talk about horror. So I would like to open up this conversation to Kashmir and anyone. Well, when we talk about horror, what are the things that occur to you when we describe horror? I personally think about dread, disgust, and fear as being, sort of the centered aspects of horror. But I wonder if you could share, Kashmir, maybe some of your thoughts on the subject.
Well, what drew me into horror, or what kept me here after becoming autistic and dealing with that diagnosis and putting words to these feelings, it still encompasses dread and fear and even disgust, if not of myself, but of perceived by others. But it is for me the unspoken and the unseen, and those things that we don't normally put into words. It's the nonverbal communication that, as somebody who is dealing with being neurodivergent, I don't read or pick those up well. And that often either leaves me isolated, outcast, and sometimes even in a position where people would look down on you. There's always this perception of what's wrong with you. Why isn't this easy for you? And when there are no words for it and nobody to explain it to you, it does become feeling of horror. And that's definitely something I've tried to put visuals to in my work.
And when we talk about disability and horror, Kashmir and I just completed a short that was initially supposed to be a buddy comedy, but has turned into a horror movie about a migraine. So I hope everyone can tune into that when Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge awareness campaign starts. But in the meantime, I would like to kind of open up the floor to see if anyone wants to contribute further to, you know, when we are talking about, as writers and filmmakers in the disability space, there are so many tropes we are all familiar with that at least I personally always feel I need to combat with my work. I'd like to dive a little deeper into a few of these tropes that we see all the time in horror in particular, and really explore why they are so damaging. The one that many people may be most familiar with is the solo villain trope, where only one character either has a disability or is disability coded, and that person is also the villain of the piece. You can think of Frankenstein or Michael Myers in Halloween, Darth Vader, any Bond villain with any kind of disfigurement or disability as examples of this. And I'd like to know from each of you what you find particularly difficult about this trope, either in your work combating it in media or how it plays out in the real world.
Yeah, I
Nasreen,
think
can I
it,
start with you?
sure, yeah. I think it sets an unconscious standard of fear in audience, especially for younger audiences that can't discern between, you know, what biases the writer or the director might have had when making this film. They're just sort of absorbing it for the first time and potentially being introduced to an entire population of people for the first time. Um, and there's just this inherent mistrust that's planted. So when they see someone who might have a physical disfigurement in real life, there's that those feelings come right up for them. Um, and that is sort of like a ripple effect throughout their life. If it never gets fixed or unpacked verbally or consciously, um, yeah, that can be a real problem.
And we
Ripple
see,
effect is something that, oh, I'm sorry, Kashmir, go ahead.
I was about to probably say the exact same thing, referring to the ripple effect. This is Kashmir speaking. And of course, we see that when it is just a kid who sees somebody in a wheelchair with a limb difference, and there's that point and the genuine fear. And we have to ask ourselves where that comes from. We have a historical bias from years ago when people with disabilities weren't allowed to be seen on the streets. So there, once again, there is that unknown that, of course, what is this horrible thing that they are hiding?
This is Ophira speaking. Just to chime in from that, I strongly relate as someone who moves out and about in the world using a power wheelchair and seeing especially kids when, you know, there's that fear response that no amount of smiling can necessarily address. And I think it's really interesting because if I ask somebody on the street, like, hey, do you think that wheelchair users are monsters? The answer probably is no, right? Like the front of mind thought is that we don't moralize disability in ways that maybe we did in the past, that, you know, maybe we've moved on from that, but we really, as a society, very much do moralize different bodies, and we do it in different ways, assigning value of good or bad or different characteristics depending on someone's size, right? Depending on someone's skin condition and depending on disfigurement, or so many different bodily experiences in this world. People who are seen as more or less valuable. And I think that this trope really sort of digs into that, gets at the core of it, and reinforces it.
I think that's an excellent point that Ophira has made. This is Ariel speaking. I feel like, you know, when you talk through the different layers of how we perceive people, you know, tropes are one of many ways in which we perceive people, but as Ophira was saying earlier, kind of the way that the flattening expresses a value preference for what one person is versus another person is, you know, is one of the sort of components in how this plays out in the real world. And so I'm really interested kind of to follow up with a question about, you know, kind of talking through how the human brain is designed to categorize and to process things by fitting people and stories into schemas. We as a society are constantly trying to fit things into our brains. And when stories don't fit the mold of what we've heard before, a special kind of magic emerges that can open up the world for viewers. Another common trope that we see in media often is the supercrip trope. In the world of disability, we often see that characters who become disabled simultaneously develop some kind of compensatory superpower. Examples of this trope might be Daredevil, where a blind lawyer has a preternatural sense of everything around him spatially, allowing him to fend off bad guys left and right, or Professor X, who is in a wheelchair but is also a telepath. Examples abound in the Marvel universe, but outside of it too. Watching Game of Thrones, Bran falls from a tower and gains the ability to see into the future. These are only a few examples, but how is this trope damaging to the disability community, in your opinion? If you don't mind, I'd love to start with you again, Nasreen.
I think it tells non-disabled communities that in order to be perceived as having value, we need to possess a talent that is unattainable, or we need to have some supernatural talent in order to be perceived as being a lead character. And that is not fair. And it's also damaging to how we see ourselves within society. Because then what does that mean if, you know, the communities around me are telling me that I'm not valuable unless I have this thing? Am I going to follow suit and try to obtain something like that, or no, I don't have that, and retreat from, you know, goals that I have? You're basically asking a person, depending on what age they are, to see themselves the way that is reflected in media and film, like the ones you mentioned, and it's frankly unattainable.
And it's that unattainability that is so problematic in terms of, you know, not quite fitting in one box or another, and therefore not having the space to be. Kashmir?
Yeah, Kashmir speaking. I think that it feeds an internalized ableism, and not to switch the focus from how we as people with disability feel about being tropes and how society would benefit from it not being like that. But but to make that shift, it does change or reaffirm an internalized ableism that we've all been born with or bred with by how we've been socialized, that tells us that you are not worthy, not to be seen, not to be represented, not to be a full person unless you have something that others deem as special. And that means you're not living within your body, you're separated from that, and you're waiting for or dependent on outside reaffirmation of your worth and your humanity.
That's such a great point. That sense of dissociation and disconnection is something that I think really does affect everyone to some degree at some time in the disability community. Ophira?
Yeah, I've been nodding along. Oh, this is Ophira speaking. I have titanium rods in my neck, but as hard as my neck can nod, I've been nodding along. I agree, and I think another thing I think of with the supercrip trope is it inherently, because it reflects that almost outside in perspective of disability, right? This like non-disabled perspective of what disability is. It positions disability as the inciting incident of a story, that there's some sort of a problem. I think all of the characters that you mentioned, Ariel, they sort of become disabled at the beginning of their story, and they struggle with it, and it's so hard, and they're figuring out how they feel about it, and then they get superpowers, and that whole problem that disability caused, all of the tension, becomes resolved because they have this other magical skill that makes up for it. And first of all, totally feeds internalized ableism, and it's completely unattainable. And it also takes any sort of feeling of accountability or responsibility from an audience watching of like, oh, wait, things were hard. Maybe we should pay attention to some of the structural barriers. Maybe we should like grapple with this and pay attention. Instead of having that reckoning, it gives this wash of relief of, oh, we don't have to worry about it. They have superpowers. So those are some of my thoughts.
Absolutely.
This is
Catherine.
sorry, this is Kashmir speaking. I also want to bring up, it can be from story structure. It could be about the works that we put out there and how we characterize people, but all of this affects how human beings function. I look at our political world right now and how polarized it is, and how we're forced to tell these stories where it's black and white, it's good, it's bad. And these shades of gray that are missing, I think it literally makes our brains dumb so that we're not able to perceive the levels of gray that are necessary when making huge choices. And I know this seems minute, but maybe if we're lucky, we don't have to just reflect society as it is and thinking processes as they are, but perhaps provide some opportunity to grow and evolve as well.
I love that. I love that idea of pulling out of the binary in so many ways. And I think we're all kind of creating narratives that deliberately try to yank people from that comfort that you feel. I think, Nasreen, you're doing some incredibly powerful work as well, both in the political sphere and in the horror sphere and in, you know, various forms of documentary and so forth. I wonder, you know, for you, how does this shape your thinking?
Internalized ableism, how does that shape my thinking?
No, the binary, the idea of the binary.
Well,
And
I mean, what you said earlier is spot on. Media is a direct reflection of how people are going to be treated in real life, especially if they don't have a connection to those communities that they're seeing. So if whoever's writing the script or directing those characters on screen, if they don't have that lived experience, you can bet they're losing information. There are many layers that they do not understand, that are now ingrained into that person's mind as fact. And so the next time that person experiences that, a representative of that community in real life, those misconceptions are present, and it might, in a very real way, make it possible for the person not to land that job, or not to get into that room. There are real life consequences to that. Those biases, those perceptions, if they're not carved accurately, will have an effect on that person's life and all the people that are attached to that person's life. So, in any of the projects that I've been involved with, looking at lead characters, looking at intersectional identities, normalizing those to the point where they are not just the best friend, they are not just the love interest, they're not just the neighbor, they're the lead character. And the lead character, their lines and their character is formulated by someone with that experience, so that we have a foundation of truth to go on, so that moving forward, sure, we can absolutely hire directors and writers that don't have that experience, once we get a foundation of reality on the board first.
Excellent point. And, speaking of intersectionality, many other tropes that we find in horror are connected to these, like the supercrypt trope, such as the magical Negro trope, where there is a Black character who can connect to some kind of spiritual power in my mind, this is very closely aligned to the superscript, but I'd love to hear how racist and disability tropes play together on screen and how we can continue to combat them through our storytelling. Elevating intersectionality, as Nasreen just talked about, there are so many important ways that we can do that, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this, Kashmir.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and I think Nasreen said something relatively related to that, where when you're a person of color or a disabled person or part of any marginalized community, you put on your movie and you see somebody who looks kind of like you, and your mind immediately goes to, oh no, what are they going to do with this character? I think it has become so ingrained and so regular that anything that I am able to, even in a very subtext heavy way, to discuss that it is more complicated, moves the dial just a little bit. And that's how I try to combat it, whether it be with Project Cece. We had a young girl of color who was the main character, or the character that ended up dying, and fear of, oh, what are they going to say about what type of disability that she had? And these are the conversations we had to have. What is the perception of a young girl or anybody of color with disability? What do they assume that they, and these are the hurdles that, or this is the landscape that we try to traverse. But I think it has become so expected that if we were to, when we make our choices, when you have that person who's represented, a director, a writer who's in that room, the shift doesn't have to be huge, but it does make a huge impact, I think, because they are just so deeply overused stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. I loved what you had to say at Access Horror, because I do think one tendency that there is in horror narratives that explore Black and Middle Eastern and, basically any BIPOC narrative, it almost inevitably lands a little bit wrong if you actually think about how people are casting different pieces. And I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So we live here in the United States in a colonial society, in a white supremacist society. That's just bottom line. There's no arguing that. And so where we are now in 2024 is, there's been a push and a backlash to all the main characters being able-bodied, non-disabled, and white, and middle class, and financially stable. And what I see happening are a lot of very nervous executives making changes to what they think could, is considered parity in their mind, or is considered parity in society, which make, let's make the best friend Black. Let's make the best friend disabled and Black. And we are not going to be the racist ones. We'll be fine. It's the moon pie effect, where there's always a white center. There's always a center that has no disabilities, but then on the outside, it's kind of sandwiched with as many Black and brown folks as they can get, to prove the point that they are not racist, that they are not thinking, outside of a non-disabled way. And while that is progress, it's nowhere close to where it needs to be in 2024. And that's because, honestly, a lot of these folks making the decisions do not come from the communities of disabled people, of Black folks, of brown folks, of anyone, potentially non-binary folks. I mean, it's across the board. I can probably name only one executive I've met that's representative of those groups. And that's probably one in about 200. who comes from a community that I come from or has an intersection that I have. So yeah, I mean, you see, you know, what you had said earlier about the super crit being compared to the magical Negro. Um, the first thing I thought about was Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost, and then the second one I thought about was Patricia Belcher in Jeepers Creepers. And in that story, she's only in a couple of scenes and she has to be sacrificed in order for these two lead white characters to live. And her story isn't unpacked. She's just introduced to us as clairvoyant. We don't know, you know, we don't know her story at all. So, I mean, the challenge there is, what is that story? What does Jeepers Creepers look like if she doesn't have to die or sacrifice herself? What does her character look like if she gets to be introduced third or fourth and stays alive for the whole movie? Yeah, I've been talking a long time. I'm going to stop talking now.
Yeah, sorry, Kashmir speaking, but I loved just the phrase you used there. She had to literally be sacrificed for these white characters to carry on. I do, and I know it might sound aggressive or it might sound sharp, but I absolutely think that can be applied whenever you have a character who is flattened, who is made to be less than, to be made to be palpable or used just as a story device and then discarded. And to be a member of those groups that are constantly sacrificed, there has to be change. And I know I see it in your work and in how Fiora works, and definitely how the works that Ariel puts out. And it's, but we, in a lot of those situations, we have the opportunity to have power. And I have to fall back on what Nasreen says very, very strongly, that without having that exec to back you up, those core ideals that are necessary to make the character three-dimensional doesn't get to travel through that development process. I know I've seen it. You know, I've seen it slip through my fingers, literally. So so vital and so important.
This is Ophira speaking. I mean, this is kind of a question for Nasreen and Kashmir, but in this conversation, something that's coming to my mind is also in those very few cases where it's like, okay, like the best friends or the neighbor or the person that someone's going to meet on their journey and learn from and then move on. I also find from execs that sometimes some of the resistance is both a lack of lived experience and also a hesitation to do anything that's going to require much structural change. And I see that in terms of even within the world of disability, who might get more of an opportunity versus someone else, and how much their access needs might affect the filming schedule, you know, the production timelines, this feeling that like, yeah, we want representation, of course, but not necessarily shifting the actual way in which we do things in order to allow for those other embodied experiences. And I'm just curious if that's something that you've been experiencing as well.
Absolutely. It's a catch-22 because I feel like with a lot, the industry is huge, and there are multiple studios, but what I see consistently over the last 5 years is about a 2 to 3 year turnover rate. And those execs are operating from a place of fear. And they do not want to rock the boat because they want to keep their jobs. And so they're being told from the top down, we want difference, we want change, we want really interesting characters we've never seen before. And they say that, and then you give them a character they've never seen before, and they're like, we don't know how this is going to play out in audience. This is a lot of change. This character's Black and Muslim and disabled. What if we just go with one of those? one of those identities. One of those identities is plenty. Like we could build a whole story on just one of those identities. And there's pushback. Or there's just a complete like, we love that you exist. We'd love to support you to this point. And we can't support you after this because I need to keep my job. Which is a real thing. People want to keep their jobs.
And it is literal, sorry, this is Kashmir speaking, but it is literal erasure. And from Nasreen, I'm sure being in physical production, working with, what is it, Indivisible, with Kaya, I have learned, we know, respectability, forward doc, we know that there is a way to have an accessible set that's not going to cost $1 million. If I'm doing it independently on my own dime, it's doable. It's absolutely doable. And if they wanted to, they can and they would. And unfortunately, we do have to continue to inform them. We have to continue to educate them. I think with every one of my films, I've made it a big deal that loudly that we have people who are disabled both in front and behind the camera with almost equal percentages, because those people deserve jobs too. Those people deserve to have their say as well. I walk into a set and I am a collaborator. If somebody's there and says, you know what, the way they're using that crutch right now, that's not quite right. Those people need to be heard, even if they're a PA. And that's why your sets have to be accessible. That's why your sets should reflect the story and should reflect people. How can anybody say, cool story, but I don't like that they're Black, Muslim, and disabled, when that's the world that people walk every single day? And those stories can often be far more interesting to fill those 2 seasons you want us to pitch to you than just trying to stretch out how hard it is to not be what other people think we should be as far as being the disabilities are concerned.
What do you hope to see more of in the future as we think about disability futures on screen? And how can we shape our world through media?
This is Ophira speaking. I can go first. I always find this question hard because it feels like such a, I want everything. You know, there's not necessarily, I want a world where there can be queer disabled werewolves tap dancing in a like absurd dream sequence, and it's like, yeah, cool, that's just part of this like beautiful tapestry of stories that we have. So I know that it's a little bit, it feels a little bit sort of easy to say more, but I want more. I want more stories. I want different stories. I don't want any one story to have to bear that weight of representation. And I think what both Kashmir and Nasreen were talking about in terms of process, I want our stories to reflect the how and the what to be connected, that we're telling these stories in ways that really hold each other and are grounded in truth and care, and that is reflected in the content itself as well.
I think for folks who are not in film or television, your dollars speak volumes. So where you spend your money, what you choose to review online, what you choose to share with your community about, like, I just saw this film, it was really amazing. You actually hold the influence to the exec I was talking about earlier. That exec can't move on our scripts or take a chance on us until you tell them it's okay. So, and you might think, you know, I'm just one person. I live in like a suburb outside of a city, and I'm only 15. I'm like, that's power. You have power. How you spend your money, how your friends spend their money, it's a place of privilege. And so the more you speak up and the more you make space for us, the more stories we get to tell that are reflective of actual like normalizing disability. I always say this, I know we're not just 25%. I know it's a bigger number than 25%. But even if we're just talking about 25%, we're still pretending that disabled people are only 25% of the world. That's a huge number. So like, why are we all pretending that we're not lead characters in films? I don't know. But the more we say it, the more you say it, the quicker it'll reach the right audience. So just keep speaking truth, um, and keep watching films that interest you, films that, narratives that you haven't seen before. And for the, for the filmmakers who don't come from the disability backgrounds, don't just hire us as a consultant, make us part of the filmmaking. You'd be surprised how much your story elevates once we're behind the camera in some way. Once we're in the writing room, it completely changes the story.
And Kashmir speaking, but to piggyback off of what Nasreen said, I want to see more stories, different stories. I want to see the stories that are inherently quote unquote accessible. And I know Fira brought up, dancing. I think subconscious. I think about those who are nonverbal being able to be a star of a film. What does that look like? How do we make that work? How is that not an interesting topic about that barrier between being able to speak, but still to live and understand what happens when there's difficulty with that communication? And that's a lot of different types of disabilities. I'd like to play with structure. I think if we can open people's minds to how stories are told and absorbed and received, it feels extremely powerful over not just how we're perceived, us keeping jobs and getting jobs, but also how people start to think going forward. And even if it's just how they relate to the people in their lives or near their lives, or they happen to bump into who have an intersectional identity or disability, but right down to, I think we can chip away at capitalism. I think we can chip away at the patriarchy. And that's what keeps me here, is the belief that we can chip away at the binary as well. And I guess we're all eventually trying to make the world slightly better in any way that we can. But that's what I'm here to do, is to continue to tell those stories that people haven't heard or experienced, hoping that they walk away a little bit different in the best way possible.
Thank you so much for sharing. This is Carrie speaking again. As we begin to wrap up our chat together, would love to hear from the panelists about how we can find you, how we can learn more about your work and follow your work. Would love to share that with everyone so that we can see more of what you're doing.
Okay, I'll start because mine is lame. Go to Instagram, follow me there. It's Kashmir Jasmine, but you will be able to see it, especially as Easter Seal starts rolling out and you want to see clips of the movie, behind the scenes, stuff like that. That'll be on my Instagram, and it's my name, Kashmir Jasmine. You could also see a larger swath of the work that I've done at my website, which is also Kashmir Jasmine. I worked very hard on the SEO.
This is Ophira speaking. I always feel so mortified at this part of a panel because I'm terrible at social media. I don't spend much time on it at all. But I do update my website, which does exist. And who knows, maybe a newsletter will, make its way into form, a little bit more longer form connection. And I think that link is in the chat.
My website's allmediastorytelling.com. And I also wanted to do a call to action for non-filmmakers, non-content creators. I don't know if we have time for that, but I did this thing with my friends, and I found it very useful. If you think about, the films that influenced you most as a child, you just make a list of them. It's very easy. Make a list of 25 films. analyze those main characters and those villains, and now looking back on those stories through today's frame, identify the tropes that influenced how you might have interpreted a group of people. And then with that same question, the next time you're out to a film with friends or family, unpack those tropes and see how different people in your group may interpret them.
Thank you, everyone. I also want to make sure that we plug Ariel's work as well. So if you are interested in learning more about Ariel Basca and all the wonderful work they're doing, please visit arielbasca.com or accesshorror.com. So in closing, just wanted to thank so much Ariel and our panelists today for tonight's event. Wanted to thank Real Abilities Film Festival. You still have one more day to experience the festival. Thank you to Jane, to Emily, to Kami, and Katie for all of your work making this panel accessible. And thank you all so much for spending time with us this evening. We hope that you can join us for another Lincoln Center virtual or in-person event soon. And we hope everyone has a great night.